Hello and welcome to TPA Talks. We've got another great episode for you today, and we're joined by Nick Timothy, who was the advisor to Theresa May in the Home Office, and then of course joined her in number 10 to be her co-chief of staff. He's a Daily Telegraph columnist, and he's a visiting professor at Sheffield University and an all-round top bloke. He's recently published a book, Remaking One Nation, The Future of Conservatism, and I've read it and we're going to discuss it shortly, and it's a great read and I encourage you all to take a look. So Nick, we'll dive straight into questions. With cultural Marxists seemingly on top in the culture wars, what do you think the government could or should be doing to try and influence that debate?
Well, I think I know sometimes people say that there's a limit to what government can do because these are sort of societal and cultural things. I think that's wrong. I think there's a really important job for government in leadership, actually. I think it was Tony Benn who used to talk about the importance of leadership by teaching and talked about how Mrs. Thatcher changed the country in that kind of way. I think it's really important that ministers take a stand on some of the issues that we're arguing about at the moment, whether that's about statues and protecting our cultural heritage on one hand, but also on the other hand, there is obviously an important job to be done in terms of making sure that certain racial injustices are addressed, and there's plenty that ministers could be doing there. But obviously I think precisely what they can do will depend on the particular case at hand.
Yeah, and do you feel that it's a point that you talk about in your book with elite liberals running a lot of the machinery of government, really? Do you think that that's a big challenge, that try as they might, they simply can't change things in the way they'd want to because the machinery is dominated?
Well, yeah. So I think if you take an example, if you take as an example some of the decisions that have been made by senior police leaders. Now, it's not for ministers to direct the police on operational matters. It's right that chief constables should be operationally independent, and it's right that they should be accountable to people in their local communities. But that doesn't mean that ministers shouldn't be making clear that they expect the law to be upheld. It doesn't mean that ministers shouldn't be sort of contributing to the national conversation and setting an expectation of police leaders, but also of the people to whom they're accountable, whether that's mayors or police and crime commissioners. And it is true, I think, that, and you're right, I do say this in my book, that large parts of the British state are now dominated by elite liberals, whether that's Parliament itself and the government itself, but it's also the civil service, the universities, the BBC, and I think it was possible to ignore that domination for many years when a lot of our political debates focused on socioeconomic matters. But increasingly, our political debates are also about cultural factors too, and matters of identity, whether that's Brexit, but it could also be immigration, and increasingly we're seeing these kind of cultural battles taking place now. And that disconnect between those institutions and what millions of people out in the country think is really important, and I think very damaging to our political processes.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, and the domination of the centre left, if you will, of public life is a bit of it's something that the TPA has been looking at with our work on Quangos in the past. Do you think that that's, Dominic Cummings came in with this zeal to really shake up Whitehall? Is that something that's doable? Is that even achievable, or is the machine simply too strong?
I think Dom obviously does have quite a strong belief that the state itself needs to be reformed, and I spent 5 years working in the Home Office. I spent a year in Downing Street. I've worked in Westminster and Whitehall for a long time, and I agree with him. There's a big problem with the state, and it reveals itself in lots of different ways. I mean, I think Whitehall really needs to reform the way the civil service works in terms of, I think, allowing civil servants out and then back in again to give them experience of different sectors, allowing more people to come into the civil service after they've had careers elsewhere. The state itself is too centralised. I'm a believer in a federal UK with an English parliament. But I think also there needs to be more devolution to cities and counties within that federal system, and something needs to be done about these unaccountable, quite often pretty political quangos and arms of the state that that can do their work quietly, but quite effectively for their purposes for many years without really the sort of sunlight of accountability from Parliament or from ministers.
How do you feel that view, which I agree with, chimes with your take on active government? You talk in your book about the government being active. Surely this is the government being active, but perhaps just not in the right way, or?
Well, I think this is an unreformed state performing in a slightly worrying way over particular things. My belief in more active government comes from a different perspective, which is that I come from the perspective of, and this is partly a personal thing, I think, coming from the West Midlands and experiencing firsthand what it's like seeing communities that have suffered from rapid deindustrialization, where you don't just lose the big businesses, you also lose the smaller businesses and the supply chains. You have a kind of resulting loss of civic confidence. You lose a lot of the institutions that add up to community, and I think it's pretty difficult in some of those places to say that we just need to keep waiting and the invisible hand will come to the rescue, because we've been waiting for several decades now, and part of the problem, there are good economic reasons for this, but in a modern sort of knowledge economy, agglomeration matters a great deal, and if you're seeking the benefits of agglomeration in cities that have been struggling hitherto, then it's quite difficult to get big private sector businesses to set up, or big private sector investment to flow in. And I think there's a real role for government in trying to create the conditions where that private sector investment and private sector enterprise can follow, but also there might be things that the state can do in terms of industrial strategy and investment policy, and also moving parts of the state into the regions from which you might start to see, with the right strategy, you might start to see some spillover benefits into the private sector.
So you call it in your book the first mover problem, which it's an interesting topic, and I guess parts of this have been tried before, right? With the DVLA moving out to Swansea, parts of HMRC up to Sheffield. Are they just not the right types of organisations? Are you looking at something with more skills?
Yeah, I mean, emphatically, I am not talking about moving a kind of DWP call centre to Doncaster or something like that, which is the kind of tokenism that we've seen in the past. I mean, I think if you look at the way the state is organised, and you can break down certain entities into sort of themes. It might be the economic regulators, or it might be data and statistics, or it might be defence and defence-related research, or the health service and health research, and there are many others. You could get groups of state bodies into those themes, and you could say from central government, you could say, well, we want the mayoralties and the political leaders of the big conurbations to come together with a proposed plan for their preferred themes that they will bid for, and we would judge them on the basis of the specialisms of their universities, the sort of economic geographical plan that they intend to implement, the policies that they will put in place to make sure that if they host, for example, the economic regulators, there will be a plan to try to encourage private businesses to move to the area and to set up in the area and to enjoy some of those private sector spillover benefits. And that might be one measure as a contribution towards this first mover problem.
And when we talk about decentralization, quite often the debate is about areas spending taxpayers' money without any means to raise the money locally. Do you think a decentralized tax system could actually help with the private sector first mover problem? And if an area decides to have a welcoming tax regime or anything, or a tax competition, that might help.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things to say about that. I mean, firstly, on the other side of the coin, on the spending side of the coin, we're really bad as a country at taking into account the economic and social benefits of certain kinds of investment in the regions. One of the things the government is actually doing is looking at the Treasury Green Book, which is the the spending rules Bible that officials use to determine whether certain spending decisions should be made. At the moment, we don't have a very big economic problem in London and the South East. I mean, outside this particular crisis, we don't have an economic problem in London and the South East, and yet those spending rules in the Green Book are skewed enormously to London and the South East. So we're in a position where London gets a far higher public spending per head than anywhere in the country overall, but then also in particular important ways, whether that's school spending or transport spending, or even public investment in research and development. So there's the spending side, and then yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to what you say about giving the political decision makers out in the regions more responsibility for raising more of their own revenues, which I think, firstly, it's really important that responsibilities and accountability are aligned. So at the moment, with mayors, but even with the devolved government of Scotland, the mayors or the First Minister will claim credit for anything vaguely positive that happens, but whenever anything slightly difficult is involved, then immediately it is Westminster's problem, because Westminster still controls the spending levers. So there's a democratic problem with that, but there's also, I think, a developmental problem as well. So if you give responsibility for raising revenues to some of these leaders, then there may be better decision making in the localities, because they will be responsibility for the revenues as well as spending. But you'll also see some competition, some diversity, and some areas will be able to, I'm sure, will choose to try to attract investment by reducing taxes.
It's interesting, and whenever I talk about decentralizing taxes, a common refrain from those on the small c conservative side is, well, what if Marxists got hold of sort of a local taxation system? They could cause all sorts of damage. Is that a problem to you, or is that just a straight up deal with it through a local accountability?
Well, I think it's really important that we're not straightforwardly ideological about things. So I don't think it's grown up politics to say we'll devolve absolutely everything, and if a particular city elects a completely lunatic left-wing council or mayor or whatever, then we'll just have to live with the consequences. I mean, you sometimes sort of see this with ideological Puritans who they might sort of say, well, there is no future for a particular city, so we just need to let it decline. Right. There is no way that is politically possible, but also there's no way it's morally acceptable. We are one country, and we have an obligation to our fellow citizens in different places. So for that reason, while I'm in favour of devolving some responsibilities on taxes, we'd probably have to do it pretty carefully. We'd have to maybe do it gradually to see how people respond. because of course it's not just about the politicians in these places, it's also about making sure that the public has a proper understanding of who's responsible for what. And at the moment, because we've been a centralized country for such a long time, regardless of whether you devolve power, a lot of the time voters still look to central government and blame the government if things are going wrong, even if it might be the fault of the leaders on the ground.
Okay. Moving on slightly, you were talking about ideology, and you mentioned in your book that with your upbringing, you could never have been a libertarian. Why not?
Why not? Well, I mean, firstly, I think it's we should be clear about what we're talking about when we say libertarians. I mean, I know there are some people with whom I wouldn't differ that much who call themselves libertarians. But
Right.
when I talk about libertarians, I mean the sort of, the real ideological sort of freedom maximizing, state shrinking, ever tax cutting. People who have less regard to values other than freedom, like solidarity or security or justice, but also I think who will possibly care less about things like the quality of public services, and will maybe insist that to care about anything other than equality of opportunity is somehow a retreat to socialism. I think we've got to be realistic about what things like equality of opportunity really means. I think I'm a conservative. I don't believe in equality of outcome. I think a certain amount of inequality is good for a society. It spurs people on, but a certain level of inequality is unacceptable. And when it's entrenched, then I think it quite often means that equality of opportunity is a mirage and something that we can reassure ourselves that we have a healthy society when perhaps we might not. And yeah, I grew up in a working class family in the West Midlands, and I have to be honest, the state played an important part in my life, as it did many other people around me. The quality of the schools that I was able to go to changed my life. The ability to go to university. I was the first year to pay tuition fees and the last to receive a grant. Those things mattered. And when I look back to sort of key moments in my childhood, including a sort of slightly awful brush with death that my younger brother had when he was a baby, the NHS was a really important part in our lives. And again, I think it's about stepping away from the sort of ideological purity of the pages of a book, or the things that some people might imagine in debate, and think about real life, and think about what millions of our fellow citizens in the country need to give them security, as well as the means for them to achieve a level of freedom.
That's fascinating. I'd say I come from a similar background, albeit not from the West Midlands in North London. But I suppose in my formative years, what I saw were schools that were mediocre at best, welfare systems that kept people in their place. And it seemed to me that the idea of keeping people in their place were very much from state actors. And the community that you talk about in your book were very much organic relationships that happen between families and friends and that kind of thing. Do you see what? Do you see the
Yeah,
point?
I mean, this may be a question of emphasis. I mean, obviously, I'm very critical of things when welfare systems discourage work or have perverse outcomes, and obviously, I think most conservatives would agree that there needs to be a welfare state. People need that security and protection, but it needs to operate in a way that encourages people to work and to stand on their own 2 feet and have the dignity of providing for them and their families. And likewise, with schools, I mean, I think what I would say is it's obvious to me. It's a given that the state needs to provide a proper universal education system to everybody in the country. How you go about providing that is a matter for policy debates, and we shouldn't tolerate low standards and expectations of low standards in working class places. And one of the jobs I've done in the past was to run the New Schools Network, which helps people to set up free schools. Free schools and academies, I think, are a really important part of education reform in this country over the last couple of decades, and that involves giving teachers and head teachers and those involved in the governance of schools more responsibility and more freedom from government. But at the end of the day, there is a really important role for the state in providing those services and making sure that those services are of an acceptable quality.
I very much agree with you on free schools and academies. I think they've been a real boon for young people. And you mentioned tax cutting in there. We did some polling last summer, and we specifically looked at the C2DE income brackets, which, for want of a better phrase, is the working class voters. And we saw that they were more than twice as likely as ABC1 voters to back cutting corporation tax. And when we were talking about this in focus groups with as part of the research project, it was essentially because they understood the value of business in their area. So when people talk about libertarians and tax cutters and tax cuts at all costs, isn't it also true that those in the working classes are very aspirational, and they understand that lower taxes mean that they can get on and keep more of their own money?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's obviously much more complicated than the sort of binary ways in which, perhaps you and I are sometimes guilty of talking about. Of course, working class families are aspirational. They want their kids to have opportunities that they didn't. I think that's actually innate in parents everywhere.
I think that the debate in Westminster and in the media is very much patronising.
It definitely can be. It definitely can be. I think that's right, and I think one of the problems with our politics is that we have very few politicians from working class backgrounds these days. Parliament is overwhelmingly a sort of middle class and above kind of institution these days, and I think while it's right that we talk about the importance of diversity from a racial and a gender perspective, we don't spend enough time at all thinking about diversity from a social class perspective, and I think that would help things a lot if we did. But on this point about aspiration and tax, what I would take from what you just said is that there is an understanding from a majority of working class voters that the Britain's business environment needs to be internationally competitive. Whether that means for sure that there need to be further sustained corporation tax cuts over the medium term, I think, is a different question. I mean, I would think that for the difference it makes to revenues and the corresponding benefit we get from further reductions in terms of international competitiveness, my personal view is that further corporation tax cuts probably don't deliver very much bang for your buck, and some of that revenue might be better spent elsewhere with other kinds of business tax cuts or other kinds of business investment through things like R&D tax credits and things like that.
And the annual investment allowance and all these other
things.
Yes,
absolutely.
Good point. And just staying on the economy, we've obviously seen some quite extraordinary and unique interventions into the economy in the last few months of the coronavirus crisis. We're told that there's going to be some sort of fiscal statement next month, a mini budget or something like that. What do you think the Chancellor should be announcing in that in order to get us out of the hole we're in?
Well, I think the important thing to me is before this crisis, the government was elected with a really clear promise to try to level up the country. Now, that is a project that should not just be abandoned because the government's been confronted with a novel crisis. That, I think, is actually part of the way in which we can grow our way out of this problem. and I think it will need to be a growth-led economic response. I don't want to see any kind of return to the sort of politics and economics of austerity. I think the fiscal effects of what we're experiencing right now is very different to the fiscal effects of the financial crash, and I think the choices are different. And obviously, we need to see a serious plan to get the country working again and living again, and all the economic activity that those things bring. The lockdown has been sort of catastrophic economically speaking, but I think in the medium term, in the short to medium term, we need to try to get as much public investment going as possible in the regions, and if targeted tax cuts are part of the short-term measures to get things going, then that can be part of the picture too. But I think it's really important from both an economic perspective and a political perspective that the government sticks to its original sort of sense of mission of levelling up the country. What we need is pretty high growth, and we will, clearly you'll get higher growth if you're firing all of your engines and not just one of them.
And on the other side of the ledger, on spending, what unites Taxpayers Alliance supporters across different political perspectives is nobody can abide waste. How much money is wasted in Whitehall, and is it something that's getting better or worse, do you think?
Well, I mean, there are always examples of waste. I mean, obviously there would be in any kind of organisation, and there certainly is in government. I mean, I stumbled across something the other day, which was an academic study that had been funded by the Economic and Social Research Council into the experiences, into the othering of Italian women in London in light of Brexit, which is probably not the best example of how to spend the hard-earned taxes of people earning 25 or 26 grand a year. I think I worked in the Home Office between 2010 and 2015 when we actually took about a quarter of police spending out in that period, which is an extraordinary scale of reduction. And when you first come in into a department where your agenda is to reduce spending and to try to reassert some fiscal control, and hitherto there had only been sort of guaranteed quite significant increases in spending, then there's quite a lot you can find. I mean, we eliminated, I think, a lot of waste in different parts of the Home Office itself, and certainly across the police, and that will be true in all sorts of different departments. I mean, clearly, I think it gets harder the longer you go on when you're a government that is trying to exert some kind of fiscal control. But I think I think there's plenty of waste, and I think it's not sufficient for ministers to just kind of go looking for it. You'll just be a dog chasing your own tail for a long time doing that. I think what you've got to try to do is set up structures and reform services in ways that mean that spending is done sensibly. And I think one of the things I would take from my Home Office years is, I think if we tried to take out a quarter of police spending while running policing in the really sort of centralised way that it had been before, I think the effects on the front line would have been really bad. Whereas we managed to limit the effects for the frontline service by reform, which was very decentralising. And it meant that there was much more freedom for operational leaders to make the kinds of changes that perhaps they'd known they could have made for years, but always found it difficult for different sort of structural reasons.
Right, that's interesting. And talking about attempting reform in the final chapter of your fantastic book, Remaking One Nation. I think the chapter itself is called Remaking One Nation. You have a whole host of detailed proposals, and not just sort of rhetorical snippets, but actual concrete stuff on skills development, regional development, all sorts of things like that. So if you were to transport yourself back to number 10, and you were trying to implement the entirety of your Remaking One Nation program, how difficult would that be? And is there any hope for reformers out there?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of offering hope to reformers, firstly, I would suggest learning from some of the mistakes that we made when I was still in Downing Street and in the election of 17. I think the most important thing when you're trying to bring about change is that you bring people with you, that you really set out a case for making the kinds of changes that you're trying to bring about, and that there's a real coalition of people behind you, thinkers, think tanks, writers in the newspapers, but also the organisations that might reflect genuine expertise across particular professions and so on, because you can't make changes by just asserting that you're going to do that from the centre of government. You've really got to make a real intellectual case for doing what you are doing, and I think that's what prime ministers who have managed to lead significant reforms in modern British history, whether you agree with them or not, have always been capable of doing that, and have always come to power after a period where those arguments have been made, whether you're talking about somebody like Harold Macmillan, who sort of made his case for a third way long before he was Prime Minister, or whether you're talking about Margaret Thatcher and the role of the IEA and the CPS and other organisations like that, or whether you're talking about Tony Blair. So I would say the most important thing you can do is to make sure you are acting with that kind of credibility and that kind of support behind you. And if you don't have it, you will struggle.
Nick, thank you so much. A fascinating look at your book and lots more besides. So really appreciate you taking the time to...
Well, thank you for having me on.
Thank you, and thank you for joining TPA Talks. Well, thank you to Nick Timothy, and thank you again for joining us for TPA Talks. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and join us again for another engaging chat in the not too distant future. Thank you.